hello, everyone, and welcome to this amazing conversation on belonging. We are so excited to have you here with us. And today we're going to be talking about belonging in the workplace, the risk associated with belonging. And especially now that we have so many people that are going into new roles and new spaces, it's really important to make sure that we foster that environment. My name is ShaCarolyn Stephens, and I am your Director of Training for PPCaDI, and I will allow my co-hosts to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kathleen Costello. I am one of the PPCaDI leadership coaches and have had the pleasure of being part of this organization from the beginning. And I'm looking forward to this conversation today.
Awesome. And Heather, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Heather Hall, and I'm a leadership coach with PPCaDI. Very happy to be here and hoping the internet's working for me.
Awesome. You know, sometimes tech happens, but you still belong here. So we're going to go ahead and push on with it. So I wanted to ask you ladies, kind of to get started, what does belonging mean to you? When you hear that word belonging?
I'll let you go first, Heather.
For me, belonging means that you can be yourself and be accepted where you are, whether that's at work or in a social group.
Yeah. Awesome. What about you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say I think it's probably unique to each individual, but I think it's an internal feeling of feeling like you're accepted and that you are part of something, whether it's a group or a community, and that you feel safe to be able to show up as you are.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of you. And I think the safety piece is what pops up for me when I think about belonging. Like, are you safe where you are? Are you safe where you want to be? Right. Especially in workplaces, we want to make sure as we have people coming in and we're blending, do we have a culture of belonging? Right. Those are things that matter. So why is belonging worth the risk? What do y'all think about that?
Well, I think the alternative is tough, right? I think it's worth the risk because not feeling like we belong is usually really uncomfortable. And I look at belonging as, a basic human need. And so if we're not getting that need met, I think it can cause a lot of kind of psychological harm.
Yeah, absolutely. And diverse teams are also smart. I was reading an article by Harvard Business Review, and they were talking about the importance of diverse teams and what they do to your bottom line. But when you think about diversity as it relates to belonging, understanding that adding diversity and creating spaces for people that are different, people that think outside the box, people that have different ways of operating, it ultimately helps the team, which ultimately helps the company, right? We come to the table with different experiences. And when we come to the table with different experiences and are allowed to share those experiences and live well within our teams and, in our roles, it helps us to work better together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And I would add to that, from the person's perspective, to not feel like they belong, to feel like they're excluded means that, they don't have that psychological safety, but it also leads to a lot of health symptoms. So the physical symptoms of stress, that GI issues, heart issues, high blood pressure, things like that, just loss of sleep and so many things that come from that. But if you look at the team, the loss of belonging in the team.
Oh, looks like we lost Heather.
It's all right. It keeps us on the edge of our seats.
Right. We'll wait for Heather to pop back in. She's having a technical issue. But in the same vein, oh, here she is. Here you go. Go ahead, Heather.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
So the loss of belonging for the team means that the team's really status quo. You know, if everybody is the same and they all feel like they belong and they all do the same kinds of things, then you're not going to have innovation in your team. You're not going to have the kind of out of the box thinking that you need to propel your business forward.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important as well when we talk about propelling our businesses forward. I believe in infrastructure. Everyone that knows me knows I'm an infrastructure girl. And so I'm always wondering, you know, what are the pieces that we're putting in place? What's the scaffolding that we're putting in place? Are we even creating spaces for people that are not like us to come into the place and have a voice and have a say? Are we even allowing that? When someone comes into the space, do they even feel comfortable to share?
Mm-hmm.
Those things are really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, we've had a big focus on inclusion, you know, a lot of the DEI initiatives, which are great. I mean, we need to be focusing on those things. But I think maybe a piece that isn't always thought about is, but how are we supporting belonging, right? Like we may be kind of checking off these boxes, so to speak. But do people actually feel like they're welcome? Do they feel like they can really show up? Do they feel like they can express themselves? Like it's more than just checking off a box, right? It's about what is the environment that we're creating for everybody in the workplace.
Yeah. I think that's so important too, because when we're checking boxes, you know, it's really not typically not authenticity rolled into that, right? And so you still take away that psychological safety and sometimes physical safety when we think about race, religion, sex, creed, you know, and we start to roll those into conversations around the workplace. You know, what are our responses? Do we even know who's in the room, right? Do we understand what the differences are and how these differences function? I
Mm-hmm.
think that's something that's really important, especially when we think about languages, when we think about different religious practices, when we think about culture, right? The way that a person was raised and how they grew up. People from the South are typically different from people from the North. We have different dialects and different language. It's something that I'm saying. Do I have the space to come and say, I misunderstood what you said? Or you know, maybe I didn't get what you said. We don't really have a culture of being able to come back and ask questions, and I think that's really interesting and a part of belonging as well. The question asking culture, the willingness to be educated on what our differences are on a
Mm-hmm.
team.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about, you know, when I think about coaching, a lot of times when I talk to clients, I'll explain, you know, I look at coaching as having many aspects, but kind of two main wings. I'll say one is building awareness, and then the other is taking action. And it's only through getting to know each other and having these educational opportunities that we can start to build awareness about what's happening within our corporate culture and who's in the room and what gifts and strengths do they bring, and then how do we want to take action based on that information. So I think that's one of the rewards of focusing on belonging.
Right.
And I apologize if there's a little lag on my recording. I'm not sure what to do about that.
No, you're fine. Technology can be our friend or our foe, but we're working through today. But I agree with that, Kathleen. One of my favorite books that I read when I was getting my master's of positive psychology was The Upside to Your Dark Side. Sometimes the things that we might see as negatives about ourselves or about other people are actually positives when you put them into rotation with other people and their strength and their gifts, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's always an interesting piece. What do you think about that, Heather?
I think you're totally right. And that idea of, you know, 1 + 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3. It could equal 5 or 15, you know. When we build on each other's strengths, we have that opportunity to be more than we are individually. The word that I had in my mind as you were talking about this was collaboration. You know,
Hmm.
we need teams to be collaborative, and you can't be collaborative unless you can learn from each other and ask those tough questions and be open to hearing things that you're not really ready to hear. Those help us have a collaborative culture where we can be so much more than we were before.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, just sitting talking about it, it seems really logical. It seems like, of course, like this is what we want to do across the board. But I'm wondering what some of those challenges might be to creating belonging.
Yeah, well, I can jump in. I mean, I think as we're identifying, a big part is the culture, right? Is the culture that we're working within embracing of us showing up authentically and providing a space that it feels like we can be accepted. But I think even a step back from that is how much self-acceptance we have. So I often like to start working with what's happening in our inner world, because I think a lot of times that can reflect in our outer world. And so if we're in a place of a lot of self-judgment, or not feeling like we can authentically show up in the world, or maybe we don't even feel like we fully know ourselves, it may be more difficult to show up in an environment wholeheartedly. Because if we don't feel that self-acceptance, we're going to potentially be more prone to projecting or feeling like we're not feeling that acceptance in other places, like the workplace.
Right.
Absolutely.
I definitely agree with that. Heather, did you have any thoughts on it?
No, absolutely. I think that's very well said. And, it's that thing of, can we really expect others to accept us if we can't accept ourselves? We have to have that own, aura, is that the word, aura, of self-care and self-respect. And that really helps to set our own healthy boundaries so that people know how to treat us, because we treat ourselves well.
Yeah.
And I'll say one additional thing after what Heather said too, is that I think to be able to really create a place of belonging, we have to look at our own biases and our own tendencies, right? So in my mind, as humans, we all judge, right? It's just part of how we're built. We learn through judgment. We contrast things through judgment. We learn how to grow and change. So judgment is part of us, right? We're not going to stop judging other people or ourselves. However, we can be aware of that and still try to bring in acceptance, right? It doesn't mean we have to like everyone. It doesn't mean we have to like everything about ourselves either. But that acceptance piece, I think, is the ground of belonging. So I think it's that by learning how to accept ourselves more, flaws and all, we actually start to learn how to accept other people more, and then we create a container of belonging. And I think that's really what people just want. They just want to feel accepted. They want to feel like they can show up as human beings. They can make mistakes, and that's okay. And so I think, a foundational piece of creating belonging is acceptance, which is also not, we had a whole conversation about this a few months ago, and that's not always easy. But it's a good starting place.
For sure. And one piece of it that's a bit of a departure from where we've been on this topic is ethical funding as well. Sometimes I ask clients, what is it worth to you? What are you willing to pay for it? Right? Because when you think about some of the organizations that back different companies, and some of the community partners and sponsors that back certain organizations, they may or may not agree with adding more diversity, creating spaces that foster belonging, right? And so you either have to be willing to find other sources, right, of income and support, or kind of go against the standing paradigm to make sure that you're creating a space that's good for the people, and that the people do not just become numbers or dollar signs because they can add to the organization. And so what is it going to cost you? Like that's one of the major pieces here. When we think about corporations, especially as they expand, right? You want to make sure that you're pleasing your stakeholders. But what happens if your stakeholders do not support where you are morally? Major questions come from that.
I mean, it's a great point, ShaCarolyn. And I mean, I think that's where, this conversation, it's like we can look at it in layers, right? So it's like if the corporate mission or vision doesn't really include belonging or inclusion, then I think it's on each individual to decide how important that is for them and how they want to contribute to it. And it's tough when you don't have that support from investors, from the organization at large. But I think that there's the risk piece, right? The risk is, but is it important enough to still try to find ways to foster it, even if maybe the organization at large does not?
Right. Right. And I think it begs the question, what are we willing to let go of? Are we willing to release the chains of decades of, just, hey, come to work, leave, right? Now we're getting into more, learning about families, how many children do these people have that work with you every day? Like the awareness piece you all were talking about earlier. What makes you tick? What makes you happy? How do you work best? Right? These were topics that in the past had typically potentially been taboo, right? Mm-hmm. But now that there's more so a whole person focus as it relates to people belonging into the workplace, these are things that we have to know. Are we willing to throw off the chains, right? That keep us bound to, we're just roboting through life, right? So that's one of the pieces that always jumps out at me. What are we willing to give up for this? Are we going to do the work? Are we going to practice what we preach?
So can I step back to that from a corporate perspective?
Sure.
One of the studies that I found was in an HBR article, and they were talking about a 56% increase in job performance if the team has a sense of belonging, and a 50% drop in turnover. So those are really big numbers to take back to your stakeholders and say, this is worth working on. This is something that's important. Another one that comes up a lot in sustainability studies is the question of sick days. A lot of companies, you give your staff so many sick days and people use it because they were given it. But in an organization that's looking at the sustainability of their programs and their team, it's really important to know that an organization where you have a sense of belonging, there's a 75% reduction in the use of sick days. Mm-hmm. There's a contribution to productivity right there.
Right.
That's powerful.
Yeah, those numbers,
big numbers.
We hear that kind of laid out is major. It sounds like companies that are rolling out these different types of programs and really paying attention to what the data says are helping people to not just feel safe but to feel seen, which makes you want to come to work and be engaged.
We all want to be seen and heard. Absolutely.
Yeah, we all want to belong.
And I think, ShaCarolyn, what you brought up just a little bit ago is also, something I've thought about much of my life is we spend a huge portion of our life at work, probably at least a third, right? If we really look at it, maybe a quarter, depending on when we retire. And so though I do think there's professional boundaries that are important, right? That we have to maintain. I think creating a workplace that allows for people to bring a little bit of the other aspects of themselves, like you said, knowing if they have children, kind of knowing what other parts of their lives are meaningful to them. Because I mean, for some people, it's probably enjoyable to just kind of come in, punch a clock, do what they need to do, and they leave their whole rest of their life, at the door. That's fair. But for a lot of us, I think it is important to feel like we can integrate more of ourselves, or that part's welcome in the workplace, because we spend so much time there.
Yeah. And then wanting to make sure that place is a place that's joyful. Simple things like, do we have coffee here? Do we have tea? I'm not a soda drinker, right? And so do we have healthy options in the drink machines? Like those are simple ways to kind of create pieces of belonging. If someone needs kosher items, do we provide those?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to make it comfortable to even be in the break room having a conversation? Are there things that I need to function there? Right? I think that's really important.
I'm curious for both of you if you have past situations of times that you either or both, you either felt a really strong sense of belonging in a place that you've worked, or perhaps on the flip side did not feel that, and what your experiences were.
Heather, I'll let you go first.
So I worked in the same organization for 20 years with the same people, mostly for 20 years. So I would say I had a fair sense of belonging, but I wouldn't say that that meant that everybody felt the same way. I know some people that didn't feel the same sense of belonging that I had. And I think one of the things that happens in an organization, especially one that started as a family business and still has that feel of a family business, is you tend to bring people in that are like you. So you really got to make that effort to bring people in that aren't like you so that you can have a better team, have a smarter team, have more dynamic activities going on.
Yeah. I typically make my space in different organizations that I'm in. So I've had very few instances where I didn't feel like I belonged, but I remember kind of piggybacking off what Heather just said. I remember my last corporate job. And I love the company. I love the organization for sure. Had been there for a good while, but I went to another department and people were just burnt out, right? And so when you think about that perspective, I'm coming in, I'm like, hey, how are y'all doing? That whole thing. And people were really challenged, right? And so you tend to attract people that are like you, like Heather was saying, but we kept attracting people that really didn't have an understanding of the mission and the vision of the organization, right? And so they didn't feel like they potentially belonged in that organization. But I think that's one of the things that's really important. So like creating a place for people to feel safe and feel seen and to belong, that's really important. But I think it's also important for people that work for organizations to understand that these organizations may or may not be your jam, and that's okay. Right. And so they might have a culture of belonging for people that are more aligned in a particular way with them, right? And so you work hard to make sure that this is a place, a blank canvas where people can come in and paint in all the beautiful colors that they love, but also understanding that it's okay to say, you know what, this isn't for me, right? So like belonging doesn't mean that you have to stay there, right? Go somewhere where you can really experience your own joy. Those things are important. And so that was really, really my experience. And then ultimately it ended up kind of tampering me down just a tap, because I just, it's hard to be happy when you're surrounded by people that were unhappy. And when I left that organization, almost 20 people left after me, because I guess I was kind of the last piece of hey that we had. So, an interesting piece for sure. But all of those people that eventually left ended up finding places that fit them, and they're happier and they grew. It's hard to grow in a place that's not suited for you.
I completely agree. And I'll give two quick examples. One of the last groups that I worked with, it was a much smaller team, which I think in some ways allowed for belonging to be easier, but not always the case. And I think we just did a really good job. Like every meeting we started with, it's a funny lead in, but kind of a brag, a gratitude, and a desire. So, something we felt good about, something that we needed or wanted, and then something we were grateful for. And these didn't necessarily have to do with the organization, but they could. And it was just it allowed each one of us to have an opportunity to share a little bit about ourselves, to kind of open up the space. And We did a lot of those kind of things where it felt like the full you could step in. It wasn't just the meeting started and that was it. On the contrast of that, when I worked in a much bigger corporate environment, I worked for a good team, but we didn't really have a lot of warmth. And I had a great relationship with my direct manager, and I think she really valued and supported a little bit more of a relationship and a little bit more understanding. But kind of when it came to the group at large, I don't think anybody really felt that. It was just kind of everybody was a cog in the wheel doing what they needed to do. And I remember when I left, I looked at that a little bit of a reflection of management, right? Like maybe they just weren't aware of it, or maybe they didn't have that skill set, but that I thought, hey, I would think you would be aware of this, like that you would kind of be aware of the energy or the dynamic of the group and address it more or do more to kind of build that sense of inclusivity and belonging. And that was a big learning for me, that people can be really good at a job, but that doesn't mean they're meant to be managers.
For sure.
So,
and I think that's a piece of truth that you just dropped, a truth bomb, because when we think about what leadership knows about what's going on, about the culture, about the people that they are leading, sometimes creating a sense of belonging requires people to be honest about how they feel about whether or not they belong, to be honest about what the consensus is, or what the culture and conversations are amongst people that are not in leadership. Chelsea, who works with our organization, she talks about glass house ceilings, glass house decisions, like from the top, right? Where we're thinking about, all these things we're doing in leadership, and we want to do it like this, and we want to swing over here, and we want to start this, and we want to start that. But they never tend to think about how it impacts the people that are underneath, right? And so you kind of wonder how that gap gets bridged. Who is the person that comes forth and says, hey, this is what we're experiencing over here? How do we shift this? How do we bring in more sense of belonging? How do we, help people to better have a voice in their organizations?
absolutely. It's funny. I just earlier today was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine, and we both work in different healthcare settings, in addition to like other things that I'm involved in. And we were talking about inconsistencies, right? And so sort of the image that a company wants to project about who they are and the way they work with their clientele or their patient base. In this case, I'll use a hospital as an example. So many hospitals recently have been rebranding and talking about kind of this more personalized care and more time with people. But then it's an interesting thing to work for these organizations and then see how they're treating their employees, and where there might be inconsistencies in the things that they allow, or the extra services that they offer for employees, or kind of double standards that might exist. And I think that's another area that's really worth looking at is, okay, what is the image that we're projecting out to the public? And are we staying consistent with the people that really, in a way, matter the most? Because it's the people who are making this organization run. And I think by having a little bit more of that consistency and checking in with employees to see what's important to them is also going to help support a workforce that's going to want to stay, that's going to want to be engaged, that are going to be happy with their work.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Heather?
Well, when you were talking earlier, the word that kept coming to my mind was purpose. As individuals, we need to understand our purpose, but then as we start working with an organization, we need to know that our purpose matches that and our values match that of the organization. They don't all have to be identical, but they need to be in alignment. And so, when you talk about an organization that's inconsistent, it's a great example of an organization that hasn't really looked at its mission, vision, values, and hasn't really aligned them in a way like that you could.
Yeah. And people tend to not quit jobs. They quit leaders.
Right.
They quit missions. They quit visions that are inconsistent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Especially when we think about again, back to the finances, when we think about pay equity, those types of things are important. Can I belong here? Can I afford to belong here?
Right.
I think that's a major thing as well. It kind of ties back into awareness as well. Like, what are these people that work with us? What are their challenges? How can we help them show up better in the space? For sure.
So I'm wondering if maybe it's a good time to talk a little bit too about ways that we can help foster belonging, in an organization, because it's theoretically it sounds great, but it's like practically, what does that look like, and what could individuals or leaders or management do to help create these environments that would foster that?
I
So I'm
think
curious if you have any thoughts.
I think that's an excellent question, and I would say that in an effort to foster belonging, leadership might want to look at allowing people to really own their joy and their happiness, right? Think about productivity when we're looking at scheduling, and when we're thinking about new initiatives that we're doing. Do these new initiatives exclude other people? Stuff that we're adding in. Is belonging an afterthought, or is it rolled into the plan? I think that's something that's important.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to my mind is that you often see the question of, do you have a best friend at work? And as you said earlier, Kathleen, some people might want to come to work, clock in, do their job, and leave. But for us to really feel integrated with the team, the unit, the business as a whole, we need to have some roots there, right? We need to have some connection. I use the word collaboration at the beginning, and we're going to collaborate better if we can connect better. So one of the things that I think we can do as an organization is to help people come into the organization. Onboarding is not done well in most companies. And one of the big things about onboarding isn't just how do you punch in, how do you get your paycheck, but how do you actually navigate through this organization, and what are your connections, what are your resources? So things like a mentorship program, not just for those that are high up in corporate, but a mentor for that onboarding period, somebody that helps a new employee come in and understand the culture and feel their way through that culture is very important.
Yeah. I would add to that, making sure that people have the proper resources, making sure that you're doing the work to be fully staffed, right? Making sure that there aren't holes in the positions. That's really important as well.
I love all of those ideas, Heather. I think the mentorship idea is great. I know years ago when I was starting in the corporate world, we created a system like that. So for new hires, especially folks who were just coming out of college, and this may have been their first real kind of professional role, to pair them up with someone, not necessarily who was a manager, right? So not somebody in their direct line, but somebody who had been with the organization a little bit, and it felt safe to be able to ask those questions that maybe we felt silly asking, or we might feel embarrassed. And then a couple thoughts that I have, kind of going back to this management piece, is really, as a manager or a leader, expressing to our direct reports that it is a safe space for them to be able to share honestly. I know corporate structures aren't necessarily bound by confidentiality, kind of in the way that, other environments are. But I think that if if managers really want to promote that belonging, it's allowing their direct reports to know that it's okay for them to share feedback. It's okay for them to have, maybe some constructive criticism about things in the organization, that it's okay that they can be honest if they are having some challenges at home that could be affecting their work productivity. Again, I think there's that fine line of keeping professionalism and also, keeping some of our personal life separate. But as we've talked about, we spend so much time at work, and it's really important the environment that we're creating. And so I think managers can really set the tone for what their direct reports feel is welcome at the workplace.
Yeah. I think it's important too for people to be able to say when they're having challenges with one another. Oftentimes in leadership, we get so caught up in, what's going on that we don't have time to think about the conflicts that might be happening within the team. We don't want to do any type of conflict resolution. We don't want to bring parties together to kind of figure out where the snake in the pipe is. And I think that's really important because conflict has a way of growing when it's ignored rather than settling down, right? Which could leave someone feeling alienated.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where, things like surveys and other information gathering tools where they can be anonymous, because some folks, it may not matter how much the organization creates a sense of belonging. I know different cultural backgrounds, different ways that we may have been raised can affect our comfort level with really sharing openly and honestly about things. And I think that's where being able to have check-ins and surveys and things that allow people to have a voice about things, but they can keep it anonymous, is also really important.
Right. What are your thoughts, Heather?
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I was thinking about a study that was released recently and shared by a friend on LinkedIn. And I don't have the study in front of me, but one of the things that really struck me was the folks who are open and out in an organization who are LGBTQA often find that they have to come out multiple times a week. There's so many assumptions that we build about people. And we're not just open and gaining information about them. We're just assuming that they're just like we are. Most people are not just like we are. And so the culture that you're talking about has to be both open and embracing. You can't just expect people to be the same way that you are. We talked about family earlier. There may be family, there may not. As somebody who came up through a corporate organization as a single person, I often felt like there were certain expectations of me and my ability to perform that weren't necessarily the same for the person who had to go home and take care of a family. So it works both ways. You have to wonder, what are we expecting or what are we projecting that our staff? So just creating that environment where we can really be trusting and open and not assuming.
Yeah. As you were talking, it made me think about affinity groups and whether or not we are allowing our employees to have small groups. Should they decide, like, is there a group for moms? Is there a group for the LGBTQ community? Is there a group, for people that are ready to retire, the people that are into tech, people, Harry Potter, Are there groups where we cannot always just be about the grind, where we can learn things about each other that allow us to see more clearly who we work with?
I love that idea, ShaCarolyn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I love that. So I wanted to ask you all a question. Why is owning your happiness important as it relates to belonging?
Well, first off, not to sound cliche, but happiness is an inside job. It definitely can be supported by our external environments and the people we choose to surround ourselves with. So I don't want to negate the importance of those other elements. But I think the idea of owning your happiness kind of goes back to some other things we've talked about throughout the call. I mean, so much of our happiness is rooted in our self-concept, how we feel about ourselves, how we measure our own success. And I think if we're not looking at the relationship we're developing with our internal world, right? Kind of what relationship do we have with our inner critic, right? Because we all have one, is a big factor. And then, is like what you were talking about too, ShaCarolyn, like taking stock of the places that we're spending time. If the work environment is not the right fit for us, that's probably going to put a big strain on our happiness levels. And it doesn't mean it's the workplace's fault. It just might mean that we're not the right fit for that workplace. And so I think that willingness to stay empowered in our search for happiness is a big part of owning it.
Yeah, for sure. And just really being honest about, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Heather.
I was just going to say, I think empowerment is a key word there, because to own your happiness is to be self-empowered, and I used the word aura earlier. I think we project our view of the world out to people. And so if we're embracing our happiness and we're projecting a sense of comfort, self-acceptance, joy, that's what we're going to project to the world. That's how people are going to see us.
Yeah. And what I was going to add is when you think about that, just thinking about looking at our own personal mission and vision statements, looking at our values, and do they align with the places that we want to be? Mm-hmm. That's key. Every place will not be for you, but making sure that we know what that is. Happiness is an inside job, right? Am I unhappy here because it's the company? Am I unhappy here because I have not taken the time to look at my own things that might be bubbling under the surface, which is really important. And sometimes we don't sign that internal permission slip to do that, to just take a look at what we have going on, pick it up, look at it, figure it out.
And this was something I wanted to add a little bit ago. I think this ties into what you're both saying, and Heather goes back to empowerment, kind of linking this back to the workplace. I think part of being an empowered employee is also being willing and able to express the needs and support we have to maybe our coworkers or our management. Does not mean we have to make demands, but most of us are so busy that we're not able to always take a step back and look at, the other person and say, oh, maybe in this case, ShaCarolyn's really not feeling heard and I need to do X, Y, or Z, but if you're willing to go to that person and say, hey, what would really be supportive for me in this dynamic is if we could set aside 15 minutes to just have a conversation, or with your management, I really appreciate the way you present data to me, but I am very much a visual learner. I'm going to be way more effective if you can show this to me in another format, where again, people aren't going to always meet every need that we have, but if we don't present it, then there's a way that we can disempower ourselves and maybe even feel the victim, because it's like, oh, no, nothing's working out for me. And it's like, well, how proactive were you in trying to make this situation better? And how were you helping inform and educate other people in how to best work with you?
I think that is wonderful. I think that is a wonderful point that you just made, Kathleen, making sure that we're being proactive in how we're showing up, and making sure that we're getting to a space where we can convey exactly what we need, and that might be possible. It might not be possible, but it's important to both parties, to make sure that even if we decide to leave a place, we leave that place better than it was than when we found it, but also leave them in a position where they can figure out how they can better serve their people. Sometimes we just up and go, right, without any conversations. And I don't think that helps belonging and inclusion overall.
No, and think of the legacy that you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You get up and go, you're creating a void. That's not helpful. But as you're talking about, being able to take some of your gifts and share them with others, you're being a leader. Even if you don't have a title to go to it, you're being a leader by showing that you can step up and take care and help other people.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when leadership really doesn't have anything to do with titles, right? We all have those people that we've seen come into a space and they just take ownership of their projects. They are excited. They don't need the promotion. They just love it for the sake of loving it. And those type of people, if I'm honest, are super refreshing for me, because at the end of the day, if you see something, do we just let it sit, or do we just take ownership and take care of it? Those types of things are important. And I think it really helps the team, when a person feels like they are empowered to lean on the people that are on the team with them.
And I think that goes to, to kind of bring in one of the positive psychology tools that we use a lot in PPCaDI, going back to strengths. I think that's why knowing our strengths, or even as an organization, doing some kind of a strengths assessment can be really helpful, because then we really can draw on those. The person who's a real self-starter, I mean, that's a huge strength. But that may not be what everybody has. But how do we build on what everyone brings to the table? And what I find with working with so many clients is that our strengths are usually unconscious competencies. They're things we do so naturally that we don't think of them as strengths, right? They just, and so, yeah, for the self-starter, it's like, oh my gosh, how did you get that way? Like, that's an amazing quality. And it's probably just a natural strength of theirs. And so how do we start to lift people up by celebrating their strengths and building on them, so that we have more effective teams, so we have more effective workplaces? Plus, people like to be recognized. That's a big supporter of belonging, is like feeling like parts of ourselves are being affirmed by others.
Yeah, for sure. Agreed. So I have a question for you ladies. What do you absolutely need to function well in a workplace? Oh, this is about to be good.
Well, I had to think through these things. And I think respect is the key thing. To be respected means you've been seen and heard and valued, appreciated for what you're bringing to the organization.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a lot of pieces I could mention, but the word that's coming for me is transparency. I think it's really important that I feel like I can be honest and transparent about things that are working well, things that aren't, process improvement, and also from an organization standpoint, that I feel like their business practices are transparent. What are their intentions with things, things around pay, expectations, and I think the bigger the organization, sometimes the more difficult that is to have. But that is a way that I feel supported, and that really, again, that sense of belonging that, I'm able to express openly and honestly, but I know that the organization is as well.
Yeah, I'm kind of smack in the middle of the road with both of you. Respect is really like a top for me. Definitely respecting who I am as a person, but also respecting my time, right? And so having a busy schedule, having a family, being a newlywed, I'm also in ministry. So, I always have all these different things going on, sorority life, all these things moving at one time. And so really understanding that clarity and transparency is going to be important, so that I can govern myself accordingly and make sure that I'm able to show up for you as best I can. And so it also kind of takes me back to the benefit of a doubt. I think the pandemic has taught us and has really shown us that we are not machines. I think we really got to see more of what people needed and what they had going on, whether it's a family or if you have a child that has special needs. You know, how does that work with the pandemic, with kids being in and out of school? How do you go to work when your children, you know, are home for a whole year and doing virtual courses? Does your job work with that, right? And so maybe understanding that perhaps people don't, it's not that people don't want to show up, but they just really kind of can't fully right now, and just understanding that we're all in that space. And I think that's really important for me. Respect, transparency, and the benefit of a doubt.
Mhm.
You know, just assuming the best about people. And I tend to love that when it comes to belonging. Like just assume the best of your team.
Mhm. Well, and I think that you bring up a really good point, ShaCarolyn, and I think this is going to be a growth point. You know, I think so many organizations had to pivot during the pandemic because of exactly the scenarios you were describing. And I think now we're seeing another side of that as a lot more organizations are returning to in-person work or some kind of hybrid model. You know, I think there were a lot of folks who felt more isolated during the pandemic because though they were working from home and it provided, you know, some benefits in being able to take care of certain unexpected situations or a little more flexibility, this kind of whole virtual workplace was really new for a lot of people, and being able to keep that sense of belonging and connection, I think, was a real challenge. And now that a lot of folks have gotten used to that over the last 2 years, I'm seeing a lot of concern on the flip side of that is like, oh my gosh, what's it going to be like to return back? And, you know, almost some social anxiety around how am I going to interact with people again? I've been kind of used to having my bubble, you know, working in my Bermuda shorts and, you know, my necktie. And now I have to actually, you know, get ready for work. And so I think this topic is really valuable at this time for companies to be thinking about how they're going to support reintegration, how they're going to get teams kind of familiarized and comfortable with each other again, and supporting people feeling support with whatever kind of hybrid work model that they might need. So I think this is really timely.
Yeah, for sure. And as you were talking, the word that was kind of coming up for me was flexibility. We have really gotten addicted to the flexibility of being able to say, hey, I need to take my kid to a doctor's appointment. I can work late from home and I don't have to leave the office and miss hours commuting and then come back to the office and trying to get back into the flow of things. I can pop them to the doctor, take my laptop with me, you know, like the flexibility of it. And I really think it has allowed people to take better care of their mental health as well. Not having to have those commutes. I know when I was in grad school, my commute used to be for my internship about 6 hours a day. When you think about all the time that you lose with that, or even when I was going to class, it was at least an hour and a half to 2 hours one way. Right. And so when we went to virtual class, I was thriving because my classmates, you know, they might have had to drive 10 or 15 minutes to get to school. And so they had that additional time to focus and do what they had to do. I had to come home after that long commute and try to cook and get something to eat and take a nap before I can study. So it really changed the game for me when I was able to do virtual class. Mm-hmm. So just thinking about, you know, the people that are coming from distances, what is a person's commute? That's something simple. You know, when you think about belonging, what time are we having these meetings? Are they even able to make it at 8 o'clock meeting if they're 2 hours away from the office in traffic, right? Simple things for sure. So, final burning thoughts on belonging. Go ahead.
Get some. It's something that, as we said at the beginning, it's something that is a basic need of humans. And so I think it is important to know that you need this and you deserve belonging.
Awesome.
Absolutely. And I'll just take that, I'll kind of piggyback off of what Heather said, that, and if you're not feeling it, to look at ways that you might help also foster it, because probably other people aren't feeling it either. And, that can be a place where we can get creative, right? We can't always leave it up to other people to do that. But if like creating an affinity group or, just being courageous to have a conversation, a little more vulnerable conversation with a coworker or someone, a lot of times our vulnerability invites other people's, and then that can really help support more of a sense of belonging as well.
For sure. If I had one final thought on belonging, I would say to people in leadership and all the way throughout the company, it costs you nothing to create a safe space. Make sure people are safe on your watch. If you see something, say something, have the courage to speak up. And even if you don't want to go straight to leadership or HR, it costs you nothing to just check in on a person that's sitting at the next cubicle or the next office over. I think that's my major thing with belonging.
Great point.
I appreciate you lovely ladies for joining me today as we had this candid conversation on belonging. And I appreciated everyone that logged in to watch this stream. We are always grateful when you're checking in on us, and we hope to see you on broadcast in the future. Feel free to go check out our website, www.PPCaDI.com. Let us know what you think. Have a great day.
Bye, everyone.